then. Hi everyone, my name's Callum. I'm a third year at Glasgow, and alongside Amy, I'm just going to go over some sort of common interview questions that you might encounter throughout your medical school interviews. So in the first part of this talk, I'm going to cover a bit about motivations for medicine. So common questions you might be asked about why you want to study medicine, why you might want to study at a particular medical school. I'll then be looking at how you can approach some work experience questions, how you can approach questions about your extracurriculars and those sort of core skills needed for medicine. And then I'll look a bit about how medical schools might use your personal statement during your interviews. And also a question that I found quite hard, which is asking about your biggest weakness or a time you made a mistake. So hopefully by the end of this talk, I would have given you a framework to help approach these questions. What I would say for all of them is it's a good idea to have sort of a rough idea in your head about how you would approach them, but don't rote learn an answer, as that's just going to look unnatural. And then in the second part of the talk, Amy's going to go over some scenario-based questions, some questions about ethics and sort of about the NHS. So I'll get started by talking about probably the most common question that you get at interview, which is why do you want to study medicine? So I think this can be quite a difficult question to approach because it's very easy to say sort of a very cliched answer. So most people, when they get asked this question, will say something along the lines of, well, I like science, I want to help people. And for most people, that answer is probably close to the truth. But the problem is, if you just say that, that's an answer that interviewers are going to hear time and time again, and it's not really going to make you stand out. So there's a few sort of tips that I would have to try and make your answer stand out. So I think if you're answering this question, you probably want to include something to do with both sort of scientific academic side of medicine and then more the clinical patient facing side of medicine to sort of enhance your answer, to make it less sort of generic. I think it's a good idea to use your personal experience, and that can really be anything. That could maybe be personal experience of yourself or a family member in a healthcare setting, or it could be your volunteering or work experience. Any of that's useful. And if you have those points just to reinforce sort of about the scientific and clinical side, that's just going to make it a better answer. Finally, and this is true for all these questions, just be honest. If you give an honest answer, if you give a genuine reason why you want to study medicine, then your passion is going to come through. For the most part, the interviewers aren't looking to trick you out. They're just sort of trying to get to know you. So especially in sort of like longer form panel interviews, just give an honest answer and then your passion will show through. So that's it for sort of the motivation for medicine, why medicine questions. A similar sort of question you might get is why you want to go to a particular medical school. And the key for this is really to read up on the medical school's curricula. So there's nothing worse than if you get asked this question at interview and you know nothing about the medical school, because that's not going to look particularly good. So my advice would be before each of your interviews, make sure you're sort of aware of the key points of how that medical school teach. So there's lots of ways you can do this, but each medical school on their website will talk about their teaching style. So if you look at the course, if you look in the university prospectus, there's also lots of sites which have comparison tools. So one that I know of is the Medic portal. So looking at those sites, getting an idea about what the medical school's curriculum entails. And sort of the key thing I would look at in terms of sort of teaching styles would be this idea of a traditional versus integrated course. So those of you who don't know what that means, traditional course is one with a more preclinical clinical split. So for example, traditionally thinking of a course like Edinburgh, where they do sort of 2 years preclinical, which is very lecture based, they learn all the science, and then they do 3 years of clinical medicine, where they're pretty much on placement for all of that. Compare that to somewhere like Dundee, which is a much more integrated course, where they have blocks of lectures followed by blocks of placement. PBL is another big thing to consider. So as you may already know, Glasgow is a PBL medical school, so in their first 2 years. So if it is a PBL medical school, knowing what PBL is, knowing what some of the advantages of that learning style are. Another thing you could talk about is dissection versus prosection. So these are different ways of teaching anatomy. So dissection is where students are actually involved in dissecting the body, whereas prosection is where anatomical specimens are professionally dissected, and then students just look at them. So some universities still do dissection, but if that's something that may particularly interest you, that's something you could look into and mention. And finally, I would maybe think about unique aspects of the course. So, for example, one aspect which is quite unique to Glasgow is that it has 2 electives. And so for those of you who don't know, an elective period, it's basically a period of time that you normally have in your later years after 4th or 5th year at medical schools, where you get to basically pick a specialty and go and get some experience in that. In addition to discussing the academic side, I think it's always a good idea to maybe mention something non-academic, whether that's something about the university, about a particular society at the university, or about the city itself. Just show sort of you've done a bit more broad research into the university. But the key thing for this question is making sure that you're aware of the curricula for each medical school. So moving on, so talking about work experience. You'll probably be asked a question about work experience, and I'm aware that a lot of people will not have in-person work experience, and absolutely don't worry about that. Medical schools will understand that, and having sort of the traditional in-person clinical work experience, it's not all you need. It's not the only thing you can do to demonstrate your sort of interest in medicine. The reason medical schools want people to talk about work experience is because it shows that, one, they've been proactive at looking at medicine, but they also have some understanding about what medicine's about. But there are other ways you can do that. And as I said, it's been very hard for anyone to get in-person work experience. So medical schools really don't expect that. But attending online programs, for example, we ran the Medic Insight Week program, or there's online programs like Observe GP run by the Royal College for GPs. All of these count, and they don't only need to be medicine specific. If you've got examples from volunteering, that could also show sort of an insight into medicine. And the really key thing for this is it's not about what you did during your work experience, but it's about what you learned. So there's no point if you spent, like, say, a week in a GP, but you didn't actually learn anything from it. The key thing is that reflection. Did you manage to sort of learn something about what medicine entails, get sort of a realistic perspective into the career? So the way I would approach any of these questions is using the STARR framework. So if you're asked about what you learned from your work experience, pick a particular situation, explain sort of what the background for that situation was. Under the task, what was the action that needed to be done? Under the action, what did you actually do yourself? And what was the result of that action? And the key thing for all of these is that reflection part. So what did you learn from that? Did you develop a particular new skill? Did you learn something that may be important to medicine? And sort of linking that back to medicine is a really key part. As I said before, they don't really mind exactly what you've done, and they will recognize that there's a difference in what certain people can achieve because of their connections, etc. So you won't be disadvantaged for not having it, but it's if you can demonstrate what you've learned, whether that's from online programs, whether that's from volunteering. So that's everything from work experience. Just remember that you want some good examples where you can demonstrate where you yourself have demonstrated some insight into what a medical career entails. So I'm going to move on to talk about personal statements now. So personal statements are not used by every medical school. In some interviews, they may use them, especially as maybe it's part of an MOI station where they might go through your personal statement and they might ask you to expand on certain bits. But I think the key thing for this is really just knowing your personal statement. You will have all submitted your UCAS applications back in October. So it's probably been a while since you've looked over your personal statement, especially if your interview's going into February, March time. So always a good idea just before your interview to reread your personal statement. Make sure you're happy about everything you said there. Make sure you're happy about all the work experience of volunteering you've talked about in there. And what they will most likely do is they'll ask you about specific things within that personal statement. So just make sure you're happy with it, and then you can expand on what you've written. And again, using that STAR method, as I showed before, is an important thing. You don't just want to repeat verbatim what you've written in your personal statement. And also, as the personal statement is quite brief, it's a good opportunity to expand on what they've already read. So moving on to talk about skills and personal quality. So these are very common questions as well. And these questions could come in multiple forms. So they could ask you directly about extracurricular activities. They might ask you to tell them about your skills or when you've demonstrated an example of a specific skill, or they might even ask you something along the lines of, why should they give you a place at medical school? Why are you better than the other applicants? But essentially, all these questions are asking the exact same things. The interviewer is asking you to sort of explain what qualities, what skills you have, which could be applicable to medicine. So as I talked about in the work experience, I would approach these in exactly the same way. So when talking about your skills, using those specific examples, using that STAR method, and importantly, linking it back to medicine. Again, with extracurriculars, it's the same as work experience. It's not necessarily about what you did, but it's about what can you demonstrate that you learned from that. And thinking about sort of the key skills that you might want to talk about, there are lots of different skills which are applicable to medicine. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but I think it's important to have an example in your head for each of these sort of core skills about how you might show you've demonstrated these, but also have a think about how these relate back to medicine. So if you're thinking about stuff like leadership and teamwork, there are examples that where doctors will both have to be leading teams, but also being part of a team. Communication is important in medicine because doctors not only have to communicate within their teams, but they'll also have to communicate to patients, for example, when they're taking histories. Empathy, for example, should be fairly self-explanatory, but because of the nature of the work, doctors will have to be empathetic. All these examples, if you can think of something where you've shown them maybe in an extracurricular activity or volunteering, what you learned from them, and then linking that back to medicine, and that will get you a good answer. So using that STAR method and having sort of a rough example in your head about how you would apply them to each of these core skills. The final question I'm going to talk about is the biggest weakness question, which I personally found quite a hard question to talk about. It's quite hard to talk about weaknesses in yourself, but if you follow a few steps, this can be quite an easy question to answer. So what you want to do is you want to pick a genuine weakness, and what medical schools are looking for is, can you show that you've improved on that weakness, or that you can identify a weakness and then improve on it. So pick a genuine weakness. For example, you might talk about public speaking, how maybe you were afraid to do public speaking, but you took certain steps to overcome that fear, would be a good example. What they really want to see is, can you reflect on that weakness and can you show how you improved? And again, using that STAR framework is a really good way to approach these questions. A variation that you might get on these questions are that they might ask you about a time you made a mistake. And again, you approach it in exactly the same way. Use that STAR method, explain what the mistake is. The most important part is explain what you learned from them and how you prevent that mistake from happening again. So to summarize what I've said, for most of these questions, it's just about having a framework in your head. For the work experience and volunteering questions, the extracurriculars, use that STAR framework, have examples in your head for each of those. For all the answers I've talked about, they will probably come up, for all these questions I've talked about, these will probably come up in your interviews. So have a good framework in your head, have a good few examples that you can use, but don't vote learn your answers, as that will look unnatural. Thank you everyone for listening. I'm going to pass on to Amy and then we'll answer any questions after that.